regulators and policymakers would require you to overtly be in step with their agenda. And if you are questioning that agenda, even if you're completely in line with legislation, just questioning the agenda can make it more difficult to get a license, can make it more risky to be more exposed to prosecution for, let's say, competition policy or anything like that.
How can businesses develop strategies that can deal with hostile government actions, such as EWC and Black economic empowerment? In this extract from a longer conversation on my podcast, Solutions with David Ansara, I spoke with CEO of business group Sakeliga about the ways in which businesses can state-proof themselves against a hostile policy environment. Piet, we've spoken about the regulatory environment, the market conditions as well, but in what other ways are businesses having to be confronted by hostile state actions?
Well, we have members ranging from very small to very large. And one thing that we found is that they don't like to be exposed. They don't like to be publicly associated with difficult topics. That makes sense because the business of business is doing business, providing the core activity, the goods and services related to that core activity. And just as it's important for businesses not to fizzle out into all kinds of unrelated business operations, businesses are not by nature good at developing the institutions around a business within which they should operate. It's very important and it's always part of the discussion, but businesses would like to focus on providing goods and services, not on developing the institutional context around them. Now, sometimes we may be critical about big business in South Africa, and I certainly have, and people are critical from time to time and saying, well, big business should be more forceful. And yes, I'd welcome that, and there's a place for that. But being on the radar is hazardous. In a hostile policy environment, if you're on the radar, then that policy is going to affect you proportionally in more severe ways than it otherwise would. So one way of state-proofing yourself is flying either under the radar or above the radar. What I mean by that is if you're small enough where you can break your business operations up into small enough units, and you can set up arrangements between them, as is often the case with BEE, or trying to mitigate the effects of employment legislation, etc. Then you're small enough to be under the radar. Nobody notices you. You have a good relationship with your key clients, and everybody realizes that it's a beneficial equilibrium. We're not going to cause trouble for each other. Even in small companies, employees can often also understand that sure, on paper, we can arrange something else and we can lay claim to more benefits or something. But if we try and do that, the company is not going to perform as well, and in the long run, we'll be worse off.
Enjoying this analysis? Click here to sign up for our 30-day free trial for more content from the CIA.
So that's why flying under the radar is a state-proofing strategy. Another one is flying above the radar, and that is if you can develop and provide a service or a product that is so crucial and so desirable that it's politically impossible for government to attack it, or you're simply a multinational, maybe in some luxury goods brand, and you have maybe so many exposures to other jurisdictions that if the local state environment or the local government regulations are too problematic for you, everybody knows you can just move on. So you're above the radar. The area where you're not state-proof is if you're on the radar, if you're so big or so vocal that you feature prominently in the news or in the public mind, and then a government can more easily see whether you comply in spirit and in the letter of their prescriptions. And remember, often not only policy is harmful, not only legislation is harmful, but also government policy. And so even while you may completely be in line with legislation, often regulators and policymakers would require you to overtly be in step with their agenda. And if you are questioning that agenda, even if you're completely in line with legislation, just questioning the agenda can make it more difficult to get a license, can make it more risky to be more exposed to prosecution for, let's say, competition policy or anything like that. So David, being under the radar is good, being above the radar is good, being on the radar is difficult. And I have some sympathy for companies who don't want to expose themselves too much at that level and pay lip service sometimes. It's not nice, but I understand how that happens.
Yeah, I think that goes also for some of the organized business lobby groups that tend to want to play nice with government. They value having a seat at the table, but then often that ends up legitimizing the hegemony of the existing policy framework. Yeah, and I think just on a good example of the above the radar kinds of firms would be the automotive manufacturers in South Africa. They are often exempted from BE requirements. They typically don't have the authority to cede equity to local partners. Their shareholder agreements in Europe or wherever would prohibit them from doing so. So they develop these equity equivalent schemes that are, for example, like a road transport fund or something like that, to show that they're committed to social upliftment, etc. But often, the rules are simply waived for them, and I think that is a problem on a discretionary level. But I think it also illustrates, how power works in terms of the economic sphere in South Africa.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent example. It shows that just through the nature and the realities of practical exercise of power, if you're big enough by being a big enough company, or maybe we can discuss this a little bit later, if you're big enough in terms of the networks in which you operate, and you can pool your capital and pool your influence, and sometimes you can actually get around the policy intentions of government. And it's not in your, of course, it's in your own interest, but in the end, it's in the society's interest.
Okay, so far we've spoken about the entrepreneurial level, so this multiplicity of firms and what they can do on a micro level to respond to some of these more adverse policies. But what about at the institutional level that you mentioned earlier? And how can firms begin to coalesce and to kind of build alternative networks or institutions that they can support one another and also create new environments for them to operate?
David, there are actually very interesting historical examples of businesses pooling their capital, pooling their influence, and developing alternative networks and ways of doing business, irrespective of the political arrangements of the day. One of them goes quite a way back. It's the Hanseatic League. It goes back to the late 12th century, and then you added it for around 500 years with its apex, let's say, in the late early 1600s. And this Hanseatic network, or the Hanseatic League, was perhaps the largest commercial league the world has ever known. Today, its memory lives on in Lufthansa and Hansa Pilsner. But this League of Merchants was initially many individual merchants banding together, and later an alliance of cities establishing independent trade relations between themselves and negotiating for fair, lower taxes and access to ports and in different jurisdictions. At some point, the King of Denmark was not happy with the Hanseatic League and tried to close some of the sea straits around Denmark. And then the Hanseatic League got all their merchant ships together, put cannons on them, and together with some mercenaries, blasted the king into submission and reopened the trade routes. I mean, there are also some other interesting stories I may tell, but let me stick with this by just saying I raise this example because I think what businesses should do today is not entirely novel. In fact, we should just reapply some of the tried and tested principles of institution building. We are used today, yes, to the modern state as we have come to know it in the last century or two, very centralized, does not, at least on paper, allow for negotiation with private entities or private enterprises once a monopoly on power. And that's all good and well on paper, but in practice, sovereignty sovereignty on paper looks good, but in practice, institutions can be built, they can be reformed, and they can operate in parallel. And so this is where I think the strategy for businesses working together today should be. It should be to firstly reform the institutional environment where possible. Secondly, state-proof or protect its members against the remaining harmful interventions of that institutional environment. But thirdly, providing and building alternative institutions within which and on which to do business, regardless of the level of state failure and the effectiveness of the state institutions. And I can give some examples of each of them, if that's okay with you.
Please do, Piet. Go ahead. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this discussion, why don't you head on over to my other channel where you can watch the full podcast episode with Piet le Roux. We explore many of these themes in more detail. My name is David Ansara. This is the Center for Risk Analysis. Until next time, take care.